Hello, you Tens. How are you? I hope you had a good break. I'm sorry that I can't be with you this week. As you know, I'm off at the musical, which some of you are at with me. So we are continuing with our couture sewing techniques, and I am going to trust you to do this and use the sewing machines without me today, because I know there's quite a few of you who've done textiles for several semesters now and are quite comfortable on the machines and can help each other as well. So the couture sewing technique that we're looking at today is bias binding. Now, I use bias binding all the time. Sometimes I use it to edge things in a very, very thin way. Sometimes I'd use it for a thicker waistband. It's a method for making a nice edge along something. Now, you could be joining multiple pieces of fabric together as you edge them, or you could just be edging one single piece of fabric. I think most of the time I use this technique, I'm actually joining multiple pieces, but you'll see what it means as I show you. I'll have to do this, I might have to do this in 2 videos. We'll see if I feel like picking the camera up and walking with it. I'm not sure. So to start with, we need to understand the grain of the fabric. So this is a basic bolted fabric. It's a plain cotton fabric. It has no stretch to it. So if I pull it like this, there's no stretch. So this is the grain of the fabric that's running all the way down this way into the bolt. This is the cross grain of the fabric. There's also, though, the diagonal of the fabric, and that's what we call the bias. If you see on the diagonal of the fabric, it's actually got quite a bit of stretch to it. So if we make a strip of binding out of this, it's going to allow us to sort of stretch it and ease it on, even when we're going around curves and things on whatever shape. I might be able to include some pictures of some bias binding that I've done on different curved shapes and things. If you see the musical, the bodice that Babette wears, the whole thing, because it's very interestingly shaped bodice, and the whole thing is just edged with a bias binding. It was sort of the easiest method for finishing off that edge. So we need to cut our strips on the perfect bias. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to start by folding my fabric on a 90-degree angle, so that I know that this is that perfect, would that be 45-degree from my cross grain or from my grain. So then I could do the good girl thing and mark this with chalk and use a ruler, which I don't. Do I have a ruler? I have a ruler with me. I'm so prepared. Okay, so I'm going to do this the good way. I'm actually going to mark it on rather than just cutting it freehand, because that's the naughty way of doing it. Okay, now that I've got it marked on, I'm just going to cut that. Always cutting with nice long strokes. We're never doing little snips when we cut, because that's when we go all messy. Then I need to make my bias strips. Now, depending on how thick you want your bias ending up is how thick you're going to make your strip. You always want it 4 times thicker than the end result. So if I want my strip to be, say, that big, I know I need to make the bias strip about that big to start with. I'm going to do a fairly big one for a demonstration. I can leave all the big rules out for you. I'm also going to leave this fabric out because I want you to cut, fold and sew your own bias from scratch. So I'm not going to pre-make the binding for you. You have to cut it all yourself. Now, depending on how long a strip you need, I could continue cutting, continue doing strips along here. Obviously, it can waste quite a lot of fabric because sometimes you might not have much use for that bit. So I could also use some of this and just join it on. I might actually do that just to demonstrate, get the same width, how to sew 2 pieces of binding together, because that's another important technique. Excuse me. Singing all week with the musical, I've got a very sore voice. I hope you're all coming to see the show, because it's going to be fabulous. And that's not just the costumes. So I've got 2 bias strips here. I'm actually going to start by sewing these together. You can see they've got their stretch on the bias. I'm going to start by sewing these together. Now when I sew 2 bias strips, I want them to join this way. So if I want them to join that way, I need to fold one down over top of the other to do the seam. Now I think I was telling those of you who did the hoodie last semester, you will remember this technique. I don't have a pin. Let me get a pin. So unprepared for this little tutorial. Here we go. Right. So I hope you can still see this on the video where I'm working. No, you can't. Let me move up. Can we see now? Yes. Okay. I hope you're having a good giggle at all of my silliness. I feel very silly making a video. Miss Croxon walked in before a while, just after I was finished filming one for the Year 9s, and I was really glad that she didn't catch me filming, because it feels very silly and very strange to be talking to myself in an empty room. Okay, so I'm actually going to pin them together like this. You see that? Now you might think, why is that little extra flappy bit up there? Surely you should join them together so they're even. But remember, that's seam allowance. So where my seam's coming to, they actually do meet and they are even. Because then when I turn it out, their line continues nicely. You can have a play with that on yours and see what happens if you do it the other way. Because you can then, well, you could cut that off if you needed to, but you're going to sew that off anyway. You're going to sew that into your fabric in a moment. All right, so we're going to go and sew these together. I will bring you over to my machine. Let's do this. Hello, Messy Textiles room. This is lots of musical tops that Mr. Salvador glittered. You see all that wonderful glitter glue by Mr. Salvador. What we won't tell him is that he went out and bought the wrong size. He went on a little shopping trip for us to buy all these t-shirts, and of course he bought the kids' size, not the ladies' size, so I had to duck out and get more, but we're not going to tell him that, okay? Alright, let's make sure you can see. So my machine is, oh, it's currently on the wrong stitch, so I'm going to put it on a straight stitch, which is 13. On a straight stitch, I want 0 width and I want about 2.5 for my length. So I'm going to sew this seam down, taking the pins out as I go. Always back stitching. Back stitching at the top and end. Always trim off your loose threads as you go. I haven't been as good at reminding you guys to do this, but it's really important that you trim your loose threads off as you go so that they can stay neat. Right, so there, those 2 pieces are joined together. We're now going to fold this into our bias bind strip. So now you're going to come with me over to the ironing board. There's the chip head, by the way. That's not the one that we're using. Oh, turn your machine off, Noah, good one. Ironing boards. There we go. And find a good spot to put you down here. You know, that nearly fell off the edge. Okay, now are we going to be able to see this? Yes, we're going to be able to see it. Lovely. Right, so to iron my strip into a bias bind, firstly, I've got to let my iron warm up for a second. If I was very clever, I'd get editing software and I'd just edit this out so it looks like, bam, she's at the ironing board. Bam, she's back at the sewing machine. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it directly in half with right sides not going together. We're putting wrong sides together, excuse me. So very different to when we're sewing. So wrong sides going together this time. And I'm going to iron a crease down the middle, the whole way down. I just started in the center because there's going to be less stretch there where that seam is. So it's good to do that because if I'm pulling at the stretch, I might actually be folding the wrong bit to the other side. I don't know if that makes any sense. All hopefully when you play around with it, you can see what I mean. If you sort of stretch something from one side more than you're stretching it from the other side, you might actually be joining it wrong, and you might be ironing it into like a pulled out state that won't sit nicely. Okay, so firstly ironed, I creased the whole way along the center. Now I'm going to open it up and I'm going to use that line. I hope you can see this well. I'm going to use this line. I'm going to fold the two centers into each other. Now you're going to slightly iron out your center crease when you do this, but it's okay. It's still worth putting that center crease in. Sometimes when I'm very lazy at home, actually, I was going to say when I'm very lazy at home, I just don't do the center crease. And I realize when I'm very lazy at home, I don't even iron it to start with. But you're going to iron it because you're not lazy. Now's the time for me to tell you, while you're struggling over folding and ironing bias binding strips, that you can actually buy bias binding pre-made like this. You can also buy a really nifty little machine that pre-folds it for you as you iron it along. So I only just found out about that machine about a year ago, so I really should buy one. It's just a little doobalaki that kind of does the holding in place for you. So now I have a bias strip. So now I can see when it's finished how thick my bias binding is going to be. So now we're going to go back to the sewing machine. And I'll place you here. I forgot to bring the other fabric over, so I'm going to get that. Just add your own background music in during all these little interludes. Okay. So the first thing, now there's multiple ways of sewing on your bias binding. The technique that I use the most is I like to actually sew it onto the back first. So I'm going to imagine that this is the back of my fabric. We're going to line this up and pin along that first crease. So you should have 3 creases in it, 1, 2, 3. Along the first crease, that's where I'm going to sew. Someone add in background music for me. Okay. So I'm going to stitch along here, of course taking pins out as I go, hoping that you can see this well. Just get that out. Sometimes you might have found before that sometimes that first bit of thread gets a little bit stuck, and it's not a problem. It just can get in the way, and then you start stitching it down in places. Did I back stitch? Yes, I did. Remembering, if you want to line things up, don't be staring there. I look around about here and line it up there, because by the time it gets to the needle, it's too late to do anything about it. As I come to the join of the bias strip, it just so happens that it's pretty much joining in the corner, but you would just sew over it. Just make sure that the seam is open and pressed open for yourself. Right. So that's step 1. It's great that I've used a very contrasting colour so you can see it well. That I'll pretend that that was perfectly planned, and it is not, because I happen to be sewing something white just before this. So now what I'm going to do is fold over my top end like this. Now the reason I like to do it from the right side, so from the wrong side first and then onto the right side, is so that I can do this as a very nice neat top stitch. The alternative method is that if this is my right side of my fabric, I would then do what's called a stitch in the ditch. Stitch in the ditch is really good. It's not so, it's a bit trickier if you're on really slippery fabric. I'm going to maybe do like a half-half demonstration here. So let's now pretend that this is actually my right side of my fabric. So this is the side that's already sewn down onto. I'm going to fold this so that's slightly overlapping at the back. And I'm going to sew it down. I haven't done stitch in the ditch for ages because I'm lazy. There we go. So I'm actually going to sew literally in the ditch of my seam. And hopefully, now if I was using the same thread color as my fabric, this would disguise really nicely. And until I stopped pinning, so it's all come undone. There it is. So the thing I find about this technique is that it's reliant on you having pinned it really well so that it's catching nicely at the back, so that all of it at the back is caught. Sometimes if your back bit was going up, you might have sections where it didn't even sew on it and it's not caught down. So that is one nice technique for finishing off the binding. And as you can see, well, I made a little mistake there. I went onto it rather than in the ditch of it. But if I was using the same thread color, and on quite a heavyweight fabric, that could disguise quite well. However, as I said, I like to do it the other way around most of the time, so that the second side is actually the right side of my fabric. You can have a go at both. I think you'll get time. So now I suppose it comes from a feeling that I feel more comfortable controlling a neat top stitch than I do making sure it's catching something that I can't even see at the back. So now I'm just going to top stitch and just follow along the very, very edge of this nicely. It actually doesn't matter too much where it's catching on the back because it's already sewn down to the back. Trimming off all your loose threads as you go. Okay, so you can see that from the front. I hope it's coming out well. From the front, but then from the back, it's actually a little bit messier. Hopefully that is, let's see if I can make that look better. There you go. So from the back, that's looking a lot messier, but from the front, I tend to like having the front nice and neat. So you can choose what technique works best for you. If you get up to it, you can have a go at doing a mitered corner as you turn. So a mitered corner, I kind of needed to start it before I did the second side of this, but essentially it's folding the corner over like this. It's more difficult in this case because I've got my seam on the corner. My seam in the bias is on that corner. So it's actually making it more difficult because it's like heavier and bulkier right there. Essentially, this is going to be a very messy version of a mitered corner. Go that way, please, fabric. Essentially, a mitered corner folds in on a diagonal with some difficulty sometimes and sits like that. And then you could keep, if that's sitting right, which it's not at the moment, this is why I should have done it first. And then I could keep joining it down that way and it would be a nice edge. So this is your technique to practice today. So I'm going to leave the roll of fabric. I will probably just leave it on, if you can see that corner right there, I'll leave the roll of fabric there for you. I have pre-cut these little brown squares and I'll leave them, where will I leave these? I might leave them up in that corner. See that yellow folder right there? I'll leave them on top of that folder for you. All right, and there's the teacup again. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy doing bias binding, and I'll see you next week.